My daughter said I was too old to matter. So I bought her startup and shut it down. I never thought my own daughter would tell me I was too old to matter. I was sitting at her polished dinner table in Pacific Heights, wearing the navy dress I'd bought for Harold's funeral 2 years ago, watching Brooke charm potential investors with her perfectly rehearsed pitch about Vitalé, her wellness technology startup. The crystal water glass in my hand had been a wedding gift from my mother-in-law 47 years ago. I'd raised Brooke with these same glasses, taught her to hold them carefully, to respect what came before her. When investor Marvin Adler asked about my background in tech operations, Brooke laughed that sharp laugh of hers and said, "Oh, Mom's from a different era. You're too old to matter in this world anymore." The words hit me like ice water. But what would happen if this irrelevant old woman decided to show her daughter exactly how much she still mattered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after Brooke's dinner party, I sat in my Noe Valley kitchen drinking coffee from Harold's old Stanford mug, my fingers unconsciously turning the thin gold chain around my neck. His wedding ring hung there, warm against my collarbone, a habit I'd developed since his death. The ring had become my touchstone, my reminder that I'd once been part of something larger than myself. My reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman who looked every bit of her 76 years. Silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, reading glasses perched on my nose, hands marked with age spots that told stories of decades spent typing, filing, organizing the chaos that brilliant men like Harold left in their wake. For 30 years, I'd been the operational backbone of Meridian Logistics, the software company Harold co-founded in the early days of Silicon Valley. While he dreamed and designed, I built the systems that made those dreams profitable. But that was before Harold's diagnosis, before I stepped away from everything to become a caregiver, then a widow, then just another invisible older woman in a city obsessed with youth and innovation. The house felt too quiet without Harold's morning news routine, without his habit of reading interesting articles aloud while I made breakfast. We'd bought this Victorian row house in 1983, when Noe Valley was still affordable for middle-class families. Now it was worth nearly $3 million, a fact that surprised visitors who assumed a woman my age must be struggling financially. They never asked about the investment portfolio Harold and I had carefully built, the stock options that had multiplied during the tech boom, the rental properties we'd acquired when San Francisco real estate was still reasonable. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos from last night's dinner. Brooke looked radiant in her designer blazer, her dark hair styled in perfectly imperfect waves, her smile bright and confident as she gestured toward the presentation screen. She'd inherited Harold's sharp intelligence and my organizational skills, though she'd never acknowledged the latter. In her world, I was just Mom, the woman who showed up to babysit Noah when needed, who remembered birthdays and made sure the family had traditions. The investors had been impressed with Vitalé's growth projections. Brooke had built something remarkable, a platform that combined meditation apps with biometric tracking, promising users a path to optimized wellness through mindful technology. The company had secured 2 rounds of funding and boasted partnerships with major health insurance providers. Brooke was featured on magazine covers as one of 40 under 40 CEOs to watch. But I remembered when Vitalé was just an idea scribbled on napkins at this very kitchen table. I'd listened to Brooke's frustrated rants about venture capitalists who didn't understand her vision, helped her practice pitches until her voice went hoarse, even co-signed the initial business loan when banks balked at lending to a startup with no revenue history. I'd been more than supportive. I'd been foundational, and last night she'd dismissed me as irrelevant. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Deidre. "Still processing last night? Want to talk?" Deidre Morales had been my closest friend since our daughters were in elementary school together. At 75, she was still the fiercest woman I knew, with silver hair she refused to hide under dye, and a wardrobe that made fashion bloggers half her age jealous. She'd retired from her position as senior editor at Pacific Literary Review, but had reinvented herself as a blogger, running a website called Sassy Seniors that had somehow attracted 50,000 subscribers who loved her irreverent takes on aging in America. I called her instead of texting back. "Elaine, honey, I've been thinking about you all night," Deidre said without preamble. What Brooke said was unconscionable. "She wasn't wrong," I said, settling into Harold's old leather chair by the window. "I am old. I am from a different era." "Bullshit." Deidre's voice was sharp. "You're from the era that built the foundation her generation is standing on. You were running operations for a tech company when most women couldn't get promoted past secretary. You managed budgets and teams and supply chains while raising a daughter as essentially a single mother after Harold got sick. Being older doesn't make you irrelevant. It makes you experienced." I watched a young woman jog past my window, earbuds in, probably listening to a Vitalé meditation track on her smartphone. Everything in this city moved so fast, changed so quickly. Sometimes I felt like I was watching life through glass, present but separate from the momentum that drove everyone else. "She's built something impressive," I said. "Maybe I should just be proud and stay out of her way. Or maybe," Deidre said slowly, "it's time to remind her where she came from." After we hung up, I sat in the afternoon silence, thinking about legacy and relevance and what it meant to matter. Harold used to say that the most powerful people in Silicon Valley weren't the ones giving speeches at conferences, but the ones who understood how systems actually worked, the ones who knew where the bodies were buried, who had connections that ran deeper than LinkedIn profiles, who could make things happen quietly and efficiently. I walked to Harold's old study, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it. His desk still held neat stacks of industry publications, his engineering notebooks, and the vintage Rolodex that had been his pride and joy. Harold had never trusted digital contact management. He believed in the power of physical cards, handwritten notes, personal connections that couldn't be deleted by a software glitch. I flipped through the Rolodex, running my fingers over names I hadn't thought about in years. Frank Morrison, who'd gone on to found a major investment firm. Sarah Chen, now a managing partner at one of Sand Hill Road's most prestigious venture capital funds. Tom Bradley, who'd built and sold 3 companies before age 60 and now served on dozens of boards. These were people who'd known Harold, who'd worked with both of us, who might remember a time when Elaine Crawford was more than just someone's mother. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I found Noah on my front steps, his school backpack sliding off one shoulder, his face serious in that way that made him look older than 11. "Hi, Grandma Elaine," he said, using the formal name Brooke insisted he call me. "Mom said I should come here after school today." "Of course, sweetheart. Are you hungry?" Noah shrugged, which I'd learned meant yes. I made him a grilled cheese sandwich and watched him eat in the kitchen, noting how he avoided eye contact. He had Brooke's dark eyes but Harold's thoughtful expression, a combination that made my chest tight with memory and love. "Grandma?" he said finally. "Are you mad at Mom?" The question caught me off guard. "Why would you think that?" "She was upset this morning. She kept saying things about how you don't understand her world, and how old people always think they know better, and how she wished you would just..." He trailed off. "Just what?" Just stay in your lane." He looked up at me with worried eyes. "But you're not mean like that. You're not the kind of grandma who tells people what to do." No, I thought. I wasn't. I'd spent my entire adult life staying in my lane, supporting other people's dreams, making their successes possible, while remaining carefully in the background. I'd been the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect employee, who never demanded credit or recognition. And where had it gotten me? Dismissed as too old to matter by the daughter I'd sacrificed everything to support. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I opened Harold's laptop and logged into our investment accounts. The numbers on the screen made me sit back in surprise. Our portfolio had grown significantly since Harold's death, boosted by tech stocks that had soared during the pandemic and real estate investments that had appreciated beyond our wildest projections. I wasn't just financially comfortable. I was wealthy by any reasonable standard. I thought about Marvin Adler's surprised expression when Brooke had dismissed me at dinner. He'd known Harold, had probably heard stories about the efficient operations manager who'd helped build Meridian from a garage startup into a company that sold for $200 million. Marvin understood that success in Silicon Valley wasn't just about having brilliant ideas. It was about execution, about understanding how to turn vision into sustainable business. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to show my daughter that being old didn't mean being powerless. I was going to remind her that the technology world she dominated had been built by people like Harold and me. People who understood that true innovation required more than flashy presentations and social media buzz. I was going to buy her company, and then I was going to teach her what it really meant to matter. The next morning, I dressed carefully in my best charcoal suit, the one I'd worn to Harold's funeral but had tailored afterward because I couldn't bear to waste good clothing. I'd always believed that how you presented yourself determined how seriously people took you, a lesson that had served me well in boardrooms full of men who initially saw only a middle-aged woman taking notes. I drove to downtown San Francisco, to the glass tower that housed Meridian Capital, Marvin Adler's investment firm. The building represented everything new San Francisco had become. Sleek, expensive, intimidating to anyone who remembered when this neighborhood had been warehouses and dive bars. But I remembered when Marvin was just another young analyst, trying to make his mark, when he'd called Harold for advice on tech trends and emerging markets. The receptionist, a polished young woman who probably earned more than I had in my final years at Meridian Logistics, looked at me with barely concealed skepticism when I asked to see Mr. Adler. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone suggesting that someone my age couldn't possibly have legitimate business here. "Please tell him Elaine Crawford is here," I said calmly. "Harold Crawford's widow." 5 minutes later, Marvin himself appeared in the lobby, his face breaking into a genuine smile. He was 68, but carried himself like a man who'd never allowed age to diminish his relevance. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his handshake firm, his expensive suit tailored to hide the slight thickening around his middle. "Elaine," he said warmly, "I was hoping you'd call after last night. That was uncomfortable." "Yes," I said simply. It was. He led me to his corner office, which offered a stunning view of the Bay Bridge and featured walls lined with photographs of Marvin with tech luminaries, politicians, and celebrities. But what caught my attention was a small framed photo on his desk, Harold and Marvin at a company retreat in 1998, both of them laughing at some joke I couldn't remember. "I still miss him," Marvin said, noticing my gaze. Harold had a gift for seeing the potential in ideas that seemed impossible. "And you," He paused, studying my face. You had a gift for making those impossible ideas actually work. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, it's fact. I remember when Meridian was hemorrhaging money because Harold kept adding features without considering operational costs. You're the one who restructured the development timeline, renegotiated supplier contracts, and figured out how to scale production without sacrificing quality. Harold was the visionary, but you were the architect. I felt something inside me straighten, a forgotten confidence returning. Brooke doesn't see it that way. Brooke doesn't know what she doesn't know. Marvin leaned back in his chair. She's built something impressive with Vitalé. I'll give her that. But she's also making mistakes that could have been avoided with more experienced guidance. The company is growing too fast, burning through cash, making promises to investors that might be hard to keep. What kind of promises? Marvin was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to share. User acquisition numbers that depend on marketing strategies that aren't sustainable long-term. Revenue projections based on partnerships that haven't been finalized. It's not fraud exactly, but it's optimistic. How optimistic? The kind of optimistic that could lead to a very expensive correction if the numbers don't materialize. I thought about the confident way Brooke had presented last night, the investors hanging on her every word. She'd built her entire professional identity on being the young genius who could do no wrong. But even young geniuses needed operational wisdom. Marvin, I said carefully, if someone wanted to acquire a significant stake in Vitalé, how would they go about it? His eyebrows shot up. Elaine, that's not something you'd want to attempt without serious capital and even more serious legal counsel. I have both. Do you really? He looked at me with new interest. Because Vitalé's current valuation is around $40 million. A controlling interest would require $21 million, I said. I've done my research. Marvin was quiet for a long moment. Harold left you in better shape than I realized. We left each other in good shape. We were partners in everything, including investment decisions. Even so, buying into Vitalé wouldn't be simple. Brooke and her co-founder hold the majority of shares, and they've been very careful about maintaining control. You'd need to find investors willing to sell, and you'd need to do it quietly if you don't want to tip them off. Can it be done? Marvin smiled slowly. Elaine, in Silicon Valley, anything can be done if you have enough money and the right connections. The question is whether you really want to do this. Taking on your own daughter in the business world, that's not something you can undo. I thought about Noah's worried face yesterday, about the way Brooke had looked right through me at dinner, about all the years I'd spent making other people's dreams possible, while my own voice grew quieter and quieter. She needs to learn that experience has value, I said. That wisdom doesn't expire at 40, that the people who came before her built the foundation she's standing on. And if she never forgives you? The question hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't allowed myself to consider that possibility, the chance that proving my relevance might cost me my daughter's love permanently. Then at least she'll know I mattered, I said finally. Marvin nodded slowly. In that case, you'll need more than money. You'll need a strategy that's absolutely bulletproof, because Brooke won't go down easily. And when she figures out what you're doing, she'll fight back with everything she has. I'm counting on it. He opened his laptop and began typing. There are 3 early investors who've been talking about diversifying their portfolios. They each hold between 4 and 7% of Vitalé's shares. If we approach them correctly through intermediaries, we might be able to acquire 15 to 20% without raising red flags. What about the other 5% I'd need for control? That's where it gets interesting. Marvin pulled up what looked like a corporate filing document. Vitalé has an employee stock option pool that vests based on performance milestones. If the company misses certain targets, those options can be purchased at a significant discount. The next vesting period is in 6 weeks. And if they hit their targets, then this becomes much more expensive and much more complicated. He looked at me seriously. Elaine, this isn't just about money. If you do this, you'll be taking on your daughter in her own arena. She won't see it as a learning opportunity. She'll see it as a betrayal. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd spent my entire adult life. San Francisco had changed so much since Harold and I had arrived in the 1970s, transformed from a gritty, affordable city into a playground for tech millionaires. But the bones were still the same, the hills and the bay and the fog that rolled in every afternoon like clockwork. Marvin, let me ask you something. If Harold were here, if he'd heard what Brooke said to me last night, what do you think he'd advise? Marvin was quiet for a long time. Harold would have told you that respect isn't given. It's earned. And sometimes, earning it requires them taking risks that scare you. Then let's get started. We spent the next 2 hours planning what Marvin called Operation Stealth Acquisition. He would reach out to the early investors through intermediaries, using shell companies and investment funds to obscure the identity of the actual buyer. I would provide the capital through a series of wire transfers that couldn't be traced back, to me without serious financial investigation. The plan was complex but not impossible. Tech acquisitions happened daily in Silicon Valley, and investors moved money around, constantly looking for better returns. As long as we moved carefully and kept each transaction small enough to avoid the triggering disclosure requirements, we could accumulate a significant position without anyone noticing. One more thing, Marvin said, as I prepared to leave. You'll need legal representation that specializes in corporate acquisitions. I have someone in mind, but she's expensive. How expensive? The kind of expensive that means she never loses. Perfect. As I drove home through the afternoon traffic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of strategic thinking, of moving pieces across a complex board toward a specific outcome. For decades, I'd channeled this energy into supporting other people's goals. Now, for the first time since Harold's death, I was playing my own game. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Brooke's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about last night." Brooke's tone was carefully neutral, the voice she used when she was trying to manage a situation. "I think there might have been a misunderstanding." "Oh. When I said you were from a different era, I meant it as a compliment. Your generation built amazing things, and I have tremendous respect for that. But the tech world today moves so fast, and the investor relations piece is really specialized." She was backpedaling, probably after someone, maybe Noah, maybe her own conscience, made her realize how her words had sounded. But her apology felt scripted, like a press statement crafted to minimize damage without admitting actual wrongdoing. "I understand," I said. "Good. I was worried you might have taken it the wrong way." Relief flooded her voice. "Because you know how much I value your support, right? You've always been such an important part of my success. Important, but invisible. Valuable, but not valuable enough to introduce properly to investors. Supportive, but expected to stay in the background where old people belonged. Of course, dear, I said. I know exactly where I stand. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few minutes, thinking about the conversation. Brooke thought she'd managed the situation, smoothed over any hurt feelings with a non-apology that maintained her position while offering me a crumb of acknowledgement. She had no idea that her too-old-to-matter mother was about to become her most formidable opponent. Inside the house, I made myself a cup of tea and opened Harold's Rolodex again. Tomorrow I would start making calls to people I hadn't spoken to in years, rebuilding connections that had been dormant since Harold's death. I would remind the tech world that Elaine Crawford was still very much alive, still very much capable, and definitely not too old to matter. But tonight I would plan. I would study Vitalé's corporate structure, research their partnerships, analyze their financial statements, until I understood their business better than Brooke did. Because the first rule of strategic combat, and Harold had taught me this during his military service, was to never engage an enemy until you were absolutely certain you could win. 3 weeks into what I'd started thinking of as the campaign, I was sitting in the law offices of Hartwell, Stone and Associates, surrounded by documents that would have given Brooke nightmares if she'd known they existed. Janet Hartwell, the attorney Marvin had recommended, was everything he'd promised. Ruthless, brilliant, and expensive enough to make me grateful for Harold's conservative investment strategy. Janet was 55, with steel-gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that made opposing lawyers nervous. She'd built her reputation dismantling corporate defenses for clients who preferred to acquire companies rather than compete with them. Her conference room walls were lined with deal, tombstones, commemorative plaques marking successful acquisitions that had reshaped entire industries. "Your daughter is smarter than most CEOs I've encountered," Janet said, spreading Vitalé's corporate documents across the mahogany table. "She's structured the company to make hostile takeovers extremely difficult, but she's also made some assumptions about who might want to acquire her company, and those assumptions create vulnerabilities." I studied the ownership charts Janet had prepared. Brooke and her co-founder, David Kim, held 45% of the company between them. Employee stock options accounted for 15%. Early investors controlled 30%, and the remaining 10% was divided among various smaller stakeholders, including, ironically, the initial loan I'd co-signed, which had been converted to equity. "The key," Janet continued, "is that Brooke expects any acquisition attempt to come from a competitor or a major tech conglomerate. Her defensive strategies are designed to prevent those kinds of takeovers. She's never considered the possibility of a stealth acquisition by someone with personal motivations." "How much have we acquired so far?" 18%, spread across 7 different transactions. The beauty of your approach is that each purchase has been small enough to avoid disclosure requirements, and we've used enough intermediaries that even if someone tried to trace the ownership, it would take weeks of investigation to connect the purchases to you. I picked up one of the stock certificates, feeling the weight of the heavy paper between my fingers. These physical documents were becoming rare in an age of digital transactions, but Janet had insisted on them for this particular acquisition. "Paper doesn't leave digital footprints," she'd explained, "and it's much harder to hack a safe than a server." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What about the employee stock options? That's where things get interesting. Janet pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. Vitalé's next performance review is in 3 weeks. If they hit their user acquisition targets, the employee options vest at full value. If they miss the targets by more than 15%, the Company has the right to repurchase unvested options at a 60% discount. And you think they'll miss the targets? I think their marketing strategy is unsustainable. They're spending $40 to acquire each new user, but the average user only generates $12 in monthly revenue. Either they need to dramatically increase user lifetime value, or they need to reduce acquisition costs. They're trying to do both simultaneously, which is ambitious. I thought about Brooke's confident presentation to the investors, her assurances that Vitalé's growth trajectory was not only sustainable but conservative. She'd inherited Harold's optimism about technology's potential, but she'd never learned his caution about making promises before the systems were in place to keep them. "There's something else," Janet said, her voice becoming more serious. "In researching Vitalé's partnerships, we've uncovered some practices that might interest you. Nothing illegal, but potentially problematic from an ethical standpoint." She handed me a folder marked "Confidential." Inside were printed emails and internal documents that made my stomach tighten as I read them. "How did you get these?" "Let's just say that not everyone at Vitalé is completely happy with the company's direction. Sometimes disgruntled employees reach out to law firms when they're concerned about potential legal liability." The documents painted a picture of a company that had grown so focused on hitting growth targets that ethical considerations had become secondary. User data was being shared with marketing partners in ways that skirted the boundaries of privacy agreements. The meditation content was being algorithmically optimized to increase engagement metrics rather than actual wellness outcomes. Most troubling, the biometric data collected through the app was being sold to insurance companies, despite user agreements that suggested it would only be used for personal health tracking. "This is what success looks like in her world?" I said, more to myself than to Janet. "This is what success looks like when you prioritize growth over governance," Janet replied. "Your daughter isn't evil, Elaine. She's just operating in a system that rewards results regardless of methods. But these practices could expose the company to significant legal liability if they ever became public." I closed the folder, feeling a weight I hadn't expected. I'd started this campaign to prove that I still mattered, to show Brooke that dismissing my experience and wisdom had consequences. But now I was facing the possibility that my daughter had built her success on a foundation that was not only ethically questionable but potentially illegal. What would happen if these practices were exposed? Best case scenario: regulatory fines and mandatory compliance changes that would cost millions to implement. Worst case, class action lawsuits that could destroy the company entirely. I thought about Noah, about the future Brooke was building for her son. Did she know about these practices? Had she authorized them? Or were they the result of delegation gone wrong? Either way, they represented a kind of success that Harold would never have accepted, no matter how profitable it might be. "Janet, if I acquire control of Vitalé, could I shut down these practices without destroying the company?" "Possibly. It would require restructuring the business model, probably accepting slower growth in exchange for sustainable operations. But yes, it could be done." "And if I decided to shut down the company entirely?" Janet raised an eyebrow. "That would be expensive. You'd have legal obligations to employees, customers, investors. But if you owned more than 50% of the shares, you could vote to dissolve the company. The question is whether that's really what you want to accomplish." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where young professionals hurried between coffee shops and start-up offices, all of them chasing their own versions of success. How many of them were building something they could be proud of versus something that simply made money? I need to think about this, I said. Of course, but, Elaine, let me give you some advice based on 30 years of corporate law. Revenge is expensive, and it rarely provides the satisfaction people expect. If your goal is to hurt your daughter, there are cheaper ways to do it. But if your goal is to protect her legacy and teach her important lessons about business ethics, then what you're considering might be exactly the right approach. That evening I had dinner with Deidre at our usual spot, a small Italian restaurant in the Mission that had somehow survived the tech boom without raising its prices beyond what 2 retired women could afford. Deidre listened without comment, as I explained the situation, occasionally sipping her wine and nodding thoughtfully. So let me understand this, she said when I finished. You now own almost 20% of your daughter's company, and you've discovered that her success is built on practices that could destroy everything she's worked for. That's about right. And you're considering acquiring enough shares to shut the whole thing down. I'm considering it. Deidre was quiet for a long moment, twirling pasta around her fork, with the precision of someone who'd been eating Italian food longer than most of the Mission had been gentrified. Elaine, can I ask you something? When you started this campaign, what did you want to accomplish? I wanted her to respect me, to acknowledge that my experience and wisdom have value. And now? I thought about the documents in Janet's folder, about Noah's future, about the kind of legacy Brooke was building. Now I want to protect her from making mistakes that will destroy everything she cares about. Even if she hates you for it? The question hung in the air between us. I'd been avoiding that possibility, telling myself that Brooke would eventually understand my motivations. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Sometimes protecting someone you love meant accepting that they might never forgive you for it. Yes, I said finally. Even then. Deidre reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Then you're not doing this for revenge anymore. You're doing it for love. When I got home, I found Noah waiting on my front steps, his school backpack beside, him and his face red from crying. Sweetheart, what's wrong? I asked, unlocking the door and ushering him inside. Mom and David had a huge fight, he said, referring to Brooke's co-founder and, I'd recently learned, romantic partner. He said she was making decisions that could get them in trouble, and she said he was being paranoid. And then he said, maybe they should sell the company before something bad happened. I made Noah hot chocolate and sat beside him on the couch, waiting for him to continue. Grandma, is Mom's company in trouble? The question was so direct, so innocent, that it caught me completely off guard. Noah was 11, but he'd grown up around tech culture where kids learned about IPOs and acquisitions the way previous generations had learned about baseball statistics. What makes you think that? I asked carefully. David looked really scared, and Mom's been working even more than usual, which she said was impossible. And yesterday I heard her on a phone call saying she might have to fire people if the numbers don't improve. I hugged Noah closer, feeling the weight of what I'd learned about Vitalé's practices, about the unsustainable business model, about the ethical compromises that were baked into their success. Brooke wasn't just building a company. She was building a house of cards that could collapse at any moment, taking her career, her relationship, and her son's security with it. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions about their work, I said. But whatever happens, you'll always be taken care of. Your mom loves you very much, and so do I. But what if she loses everything? The question pierced through. All my strategic planning, all my careful legal maneuvering, All my justified anger about being dismissed as irrelevant. At the center of this corporate drama was an 11-year-old boy who just wanted his family to be stable and safe. "Then we'll figure it out together," I said. "That's what families do." That night, after Noah fell asleep in the guest bedroom, I sat in Harold's study with Vitalé's financial statements spread across his desk. The numbers told a story that Brooke either didn't understand or was choosing to ignore. The company was burning through cash faster than it was generating revenue, dependent on continued investment to survive. The marketing strategy was unsustainable, the user acquisition costs were climbing, and the ethical practices Janet had uncovered weren't just morally questionable. They were business risks that could trigger regulatory investigations. Brooke had built something impressive, but she'd also built something fragile, and she was so focused on maintaining the illusion of success that she couldn't see the cracks in the foundation. I picked up my phone and called Janet. "I've made my decision," I said when she answered. "I want to acquire controlling interest in Vitalé, but I don't want to shut it down." "What do you want to do?" "I want to save it, and I want to save my daughter from herself. That's going to be much more complicated than a simple acquisition." "I know," I said, looking at Harold's photo on the desk. He was smiling, the way he always smiled when he was about to tackle an impossible problem. "But complicated doesn't mean impossible." "No," Janet agreed. "It just means expensive." The morning of Vitalé's quarterly board meeting, I stood in my walk-in closet, choosing an outfit with the same care I'd once used for court appearances and high-stakes negotiations. I selected a navy Armani suit that Harold had bought me for our 25th anniversary, paired with my mother's pearl earrings and the Hermès watch that had been a retirement gift from Meridian's board of directors. The woman looking back at me from the mirror was someone who belonged in boardrooms, someone whose opinion carried weight. Janet had spent the past week finalizing the acquisitions that would give me a controlling stake in Vitalé. The employee, stock options had been particularly crucial. When Vitalé missed their user acquisition targets by 18%, I'd been able to purchase enough unvested options to push my ownership to 51%. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brooke's aggressive growth strategy had created the very conditions that allowed me to take control of her company. I drove to Vitalé's offices in Soma, a gleaming space that occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse. The lobby featured living walls, artisanal coffee stations, and motivational quotes rendered in sleek typography. Everything about the space screamed successful startup, from the ping-pong tables to the meditation pods to the kombucha on tap. In the kitchen, Yvette Tran, Vitalé's chief technology officer, met me at the elevator. She was 39, Vietnamese-American, and according to my research, one of the most respected engineers in the Bay Area wellness tech space. She was also, Janet had learned, deeply uncomfortable with some of the data practices she'd been asked to implement. "Mrs. Crawford," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming in early. I wanted a chance to speak with you privately before the meeting." We settled in a small conference room overlooking the bustling street below. Yvette had the focused intensity of someone who'd built her career on solving complex technical problems, but I could see worry lines around her eyes that suggested she was dealing with challenges that code couldn't fix. "I assume you know why I requested this meeting," she said. "I have some idea." "Then you know that Vitalé has been implementing data collection and sharing practices that stretch the boundaries of our user agreements." "I've seen the documentation," Yvette nodded grimly. "I've raised concerns with Brooke multiple times, but she's under enormous pressure from investors to hit growth targets. The data monetization strategy generates significant revenue, And she's convinced that users don't really care about privacy as long as the app provides value. But you disagree. I think we're building a house of cards that will collapse the moment someone decides to investigate our practices. And I think we're betraying the trust of users who came to us because they wanted to improve their lives, not because they wanted to become products to be sold to the highest bidder. I studied Yvette's face, seeing something I recognized from my own career, the expression of someone who had built something important, only to watch it being corrupted by people who didn't understand its true value. What would you do differently? I asked. Complete transparency about data usage. User consent for every single data sharing arrangement. Revenue models based on subscription value rather than data monetization. It would mean slower growth, but it would mean sustainable growth. And Brooke won't consider this approach? Brooke is brilliant, but she's also scared. The investors have invested $40 million based on specific growth projections. If we miss those projections, she's convinced the company will collapse. She sees the ethical approach as a luxury she can't afford. The boardroom door opened, and Brooke walked in with David Kim and 2 board members I recognized from last month's investor dinner. She stopped short when she saw me, her confident smile faltering for just a moment. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I'm here for the board meeting," I said calmly. "But you're not on the board." "Actually," Janet said, entering behind the group with a briefcase full of documents, "she is now. For the next 20 minutes, the room filled with the kind of controlled chaos that happens when people's understanding of reality shifts dramatically in a very short time." Janet methodically explained the acquisition, producing ownership documents that showed my controlling stake in Vitalé. Brooke's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a kind of stunned calculation as she tried to figure out what this meant for her company. "This is impossible," David said, studying the documents. "We have controlling interest. We structured the company specifically to prevent this kind of takeover." "You structured it to prevent takeovers by competitors or tech conglomerates?" Janet replied. "You didn't anticipate a stealth acquisition by someone with personal motivations and unlimited patience." Brooke was staring at me as if she'd never seen me before. "Mom, what the hell is this?" "This is what happens when you underestimate someone," I said quietly. "You bought my company?" "You actually bought my company?" Her voice was rising, the careful professional facade cracking to reveal genuine shock and hurt. "I invested in your company," I corrected. "The same way I invested in your education, your first apartment, your business loan. The difference is that this time, I'm ensuring I have a voice in how that investment is managed." One of the board members, a venture capitalist named Gregory Walsh, cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Crawford, what exactly are your intentions? Are you planning to replace management? Sell the company? Because I should warn you that any major operational changes could trigger protective clauses in our investment agreements." I opened my own folder and spread Vitalé's financial statements across the table. "My intentions are to save this company from practices that could destroy it. Gregory, are you aware that Vitalé is spending $40 to acquire each new user, while generating only $12 in monthly revenue per user?" Gregory's face went pale. That would be unsustainable." "It's not just unsustainable. It's a path to bankruptcy if growth targets aren't met. And based on last quarter's performance, those targets are becoming increasingly unrealistic." Turned to the second board member, Sarah Chen, from Redwood Ventures. "Sarah, are you aware that Vitalé is sharing user biometric data with insurance companies without explicit user consent?" Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. That would be a HIPAA violation. Among other regulatory issues, Janet confirmed. We estimate potential fines in the 8-figure range if these practices are investigated. Brooke found her voice again. Mom, you don't understand how this industry works. Every company shares data with partners. Every company spends heavily on user acquisition. These are standard practices. Standard doesn't mean sustainable, I replied. And standard definitely doesn't mean ethical. Ethical? Brooke's laugh was sharp and bitter. You want to lecture me about ethics? You just orchestrated a hostile takeover of your own daughter's company. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced my voice to remain steady. I orchestrated an intervention because the daughter I raised would never have built a company that betrays its users' trust for profit. The room fell silent. David was studying the financial documents with growing alarm. Gregory and Sarah were exchanging worried glances. Yvette was looking at me with something that might have been gratitude. What do you want? Brooke asked finally. I want you to build something you can be proud of. Something that creates value without exploiting people. Something that succeeds because it's genuinely useful, not because it's efficient at extracting data from vulnerable users. And if I refuse? This was the moment I had been dreading, the point where love and strategy collided in ways that might be irreparable. Then I'll vote to dissolve the company entirely. The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Brooke stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and fury that made my chest ache. This was my daughter. The little girl who'd sat at this same conference table in our kitchen, excitedly explaining her ideas for making the world better through technology. You would actually destroy everything I've built? I would prevent you from destroying everything you've built, I said. Because what you've built right now isn't sustainable. It's not ethical. And it's not worthy of the brilliant woman I raised. David cleared his throat. What exactly are you proposing? I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Complete restructuring of the data monetization strategy. Full transparency with users about data collection and sharing. Sustainable user acquisition models based on organic growth, rather than paid advertising. Slower growth in exchange for long-term viability. That would require renegotiating our investor agreements, Gregory said. It would require courage, I replied. The kind of courage that builds companies, people. Remember, for the right reasons. Brooke was still staring at me, her face a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite hide the personal devastation underneath. How long have you been planning this? Since the night you told me I was too old to matter. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. I kept my voice gentle but firm. You meant every word. And maybe you were right about some things. Maybe I am from a different era. But that era taught me that success without integrity isn't success at all. The meeting lasted another hour, with Janet outlining the legal framework for the restructuring, and Yvette explaining the technical changes that would be required. Gregory and Sarah reluctantly agreed to support the new direction, partly because they had no choice, and partly because the alternative, regulatory investigations and potential bankruptcy, was worse than accepting slower growth. But Brooke said almost nothing for the rest of the meeting. She sat in her chair at the head of the table, the position she'd earned through years of brilliant strategy and relentless execution, and watched her mother dismantle the empire she'd built. When the meeting ended, the others filed out quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama they'd witnessed. Only Brooke and I remained in the conference room, separated by a table covered with documents that had just rewritten both our lives. I need some time to process this, she said finally. Of course. And I need you to understand that our relationship, this changes everything. I nodded, feeling tears I'd been holding back all morning finally threatening to spill over. I know. Do you? Do you really understand what you've done? Because I don't think you do. Brooke stood up, gathering her papers with sharp, angry movements. You just proved that my success was never really mine. That even when I built something from nothing, even when I created jobs and value and innovation, I was still just playing in a sandbox that belonged to you. The accusation was so painful and so accurate that I couldn't speak for a moment. That's not what I intended, I said finally. But it's what you accomplished. Brooke moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to me. You know what the worst part is? You're probably right about the business strategy, but you're wrong about everything else. What do you mean? You think this will teach me to respect you, but all it's taught me is that I can't trust you. She left me alone in the boardroom, surrounded by the debris of our relationship and the blueprints for a company that might now succeed for all the right reasons. I sat there for a long time, wondering if wisdom always came at such a steep price. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I was working in Harold's study when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Yvette Tran standing on my porch, looking nervous and carrying a small leather messenger bag. I'm sorry to show up unannounced, she said, but I need to show you something, and I couldn't risk doing it over email or phone. I led her to the kitchen and made tea while she sat at the table, clearly wrestling with whatever had brought her to my door. Outside, the afternoon fog was rolling in, turning the neighborhood gray and muffled. I've been cleaning up the data, sharing agreements like you requested, she said finally, documenting everything we've been doing so we can figure out how to unwind it responsibly. And I found something that goes beyond questionable business practices. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. This contains evidence of what I can only call fraud. The word hung between us like a loaded weapon. I set down my teacup carefully, my hands suddenly unsteady. What kind of fraud? The meditation content that we've been promoting as scientifically validated, it's not. The studies Brooke cited in investor presentations don't exist. The university partnerships she claimed to have? Most of them were never formalized. The clinical results showing improved user wellness, they're based on surveys that were designed to produce positive responses. I felt something cold settling in my stomach. You're certain about this? I have the fabricated research reports, the fake university letterheads, the manipulated survey data. Brooke didn't just stretch the truth to make the company look more successful. She created an entirely fictional foundation for the business. Yvette opened her laptop and showed me document after document that painted a picture of systematic deception. Research studies that claimed to validate Vitalé's meditation algorithms, but had never been conducted. University partnerships that existed only in PowerPoint presentations. Clinical trials that were nothing more than marketing surveys disguised as scientific research. How long has this been going on? At least 2 years, probably longer. It started small, exaggerating the credentials of one advisor, overstating the significance of one study. But it grew. Every investor presentation included more fictional validation, more imaginary partnerships. I thought about the confident way Brooke had presented to investors, her casual references to scientific backing and academic partnerships. I'd been impressed by her thoroughness, her attention to credibility. Now I was learning that none of it was real. Does David know? I think David knows something is wrong, but I don't think he knows the full extent. He's been asking questions lately about some of the claims we've been making, but Brooke keeps telling him that the documentation is confidential or still being finalized. And the other board members? They trusted Brooke's presentations. Why wouldn't they? She's brilliant, successful, articulate, the kind of CEO investors dream of backing. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together. He'd always insisted on native plants, species that belonged in this soil, and climate rather than exotic varieties that looked impressive, but couldn't survive without constant intervention. Do something that lasts, he used to say. Build on solid ground. Yvette, why are you telling me this? You could have taken this information to regulators, to the press, to anyone with authority to investigate. Because I think you're the only person who might be able to fix this without destroying everyone involved. What do you mean? If this information becomes public, Vitalé will collapse instantly. Not just reorganization or slow growth, complete destruction. Every investor will demand their money back. Every employee will lose their job. Brooke will face criminal fraud charges that could send her to prison. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about corporate ethics anymore. This was about my daughter potentially going to jail for federal fraud violations. But if you restructure the company the way you've proposed, Yvette continued, if you eliminate the fraudulent claims and rebuild on an honest foundation, the fraud might never need to be exposed. It would be expensive, and it would mean admitting that previous claims were overstated. But it wouldn't necessarily trigger criminal investigations. You're asking me to help cover up my daughter's crimes. I'm asking you to help your daughter. Avoid destroying her life over mistakes that grew out of control. I sat down heavily, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect not just Brooke, but David, Noah, 47 employees, and dozens of investors who trusted in a vision that had been built on lies. How bad is the fraud? In terms of scale, I mean, investor presentations claiming validation that doesn't exist, marketing materials citing studies that were never conducted, partnership announcements for relationships that don't exist. If investigators wanted to pursue it, they could probably identify dozens of instances of securities fraud. I thought about Noah, about the worried expression he'd worn lately when he talked about his mother working too much. I thought about the employees who joined Vitalé because they believed in its mission. I thought about Brooke, brilliant and ambitious and apparently willing to destroy everything to maintain the illusion of success. What would it take to clean this up? Complete rebranding. New mission statement based on what the technology actually does rather than fictitious scientific validation. Revised investor materials with all fraudulent claims removed. Probably a significant reduction in company valuation once the fake validation is stripped away. And you think this can be done without triggering criminal investigations? I think it's the only chance your daughter has. That evening, I called Janet and explained the situation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Elaine, you're talking about conspiracy to conceal securities fraud. If you know about fraudulent investor presentations, and you help cover them up rather than reporting them, you become complicit in the fraud. What's the alternative? Let my daughter go to prison? The alternative is that you report the fraud to appropriate authorities and let justice take its course. Justice? I felt anger rising in my chest. Justice would be destroying the life of a brilliant woman who made terrible decisions because she was terrified of failure. Justice would be sending a single mother to prison and leaving her 11-year-old son without a parent. Justice would be ensuring that investors who were defrauded have recourse and that other entrepreneurs understand there are consequences for lying to get funding. I hung up and sat in Harold's study, staring at the USB drive Yvette had left with me. Inside, that small device was evidence that could destroy my daughter's life. It was also evidence that she had systematically lied to investors, employees, and customers who trusted her. Harold would have known what to do. He'd faced ethical dilemmas throughout his career, moments when doing the right thing conflicted with protecting people he cared about. But Harold had always chosen integrity, even when it was painful. My phone rang. Brooke's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said at the board meeting, about building something I can be proud of." "Yes." "I want to find a way to make this work. The ethical approach, I mean. I know I've been resistant, but maybe you were right about needing to change direction." The irony was devastating. Brooke was finally ready to listen to my guidance, to accept that integrity mattered more than growth at any cost. But she was also guilty of fraud that could send her to prison if discovered. "That's wonderful news," I said. "I was wondering if you'd like to have lunch tomorrow, to talk about how we might restructure things. I realize I owe you an apology for how I reacted to everything." "I'd like that very much." "Good. And Mom, thank you for caring enough to intervene even though it meant risking our relationship. I'm starting to understand that you weren't trying to hurt me." After we hung up, I sat holding the USB drive, turning it over in my hands. Tomorrow, my daughter would apologize for dismissing my relevance and ask for my help in building something ethical and sustainable. She would never know that I was holding evidence of crimes that could destroy everything she'd worked for. The question was, what was I going to do with that knowledge? I thought about Noah, about the kind of grandmother I wanted to be. Did I want to be the woman who protected her family at any cost? Or did I want to be the woman who stood for principles even when they conflicted with love? I thought about Harold, about the integrity that had defined his entire career. He'd never compromised his values, even when it meant losing profitable contracts or disappointing people he cared about. I thought about Brooke, about the little girl who'd once asked me why people sometimes did bad things even when they knew better. Because sometimes, I'd told her, people get scared and make choices based on fear instead of values. And finally, I thought about myself, about the woman I'd been before age and widowhood had made me feel invisible. That woman had never avoided hard decisions just because they were painful. I picked up my phone and called Yvette. "I need you to prepare a complete report documenting all the fraudulent claims," I said when she answered. "You're going to expose the fraud? I'm going to give my daughter a chance to expose it herself. And if she won't do the right thing, then I'll do it for her. That could destroy her life. Living with this secret could destroy her soul." The next morning, I woke before dawn and sat in my garden with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the hills of San Francisco. In a few hours, I would meet my daughter for lunch and have the most difficult conversation of my life. But for the first time since this whole campaign began, I knew exactly what I had to do. I arrived at the restaurant 30 minutes early, choosing a corner table where we could speak privately. The place was one of Brooke's favorites, a trendy farm-to-table establishment in Hayes Valley, where tech executives came to conduct business over sustainable seafood and biodynamic wine. The exposed brick walls were adorned with local artwork, and Edison bulb fixtures cast warm light over reclaimed wood tables. It was the kind of place that projected conscious consumption and ethical sourcing, while charging premium prices for the privilege of feeling morally superior about lunch. Ordered sparkling water and tried to calm my nerves by studying the lunch crowd. Young professionals in designer casual wear huddled over laptops, discussing funding rounds and product launches with the fervent intensity of religious converts. They spoke in a language of disruption and innovation, all of them convinced they were changing the world through technology that would somehow solve humanity's deepest problems. Their confidence was both admirable and naive, reminding me of Brooke in her early days when she still believed that good intentions were sufficient protection against moral compromise. The server, a tattooed woman in her 20s with purple hair, kept glancing at her smartwatch between taking orders. Even here in this temple to mindful consumption, the relentless pace of Silicon Valley intruded. Everyone was always connected, always monitoring metrics, always optimizing for the next opportunity. Brooke arrived precisely on time, looking polished in a black blazer that probably cost more than most people spent on clothes in a year. She carried the leather portfolio she used for important meetings, the one Harold had given her when she graduated from Stanford, but I could see stress in the tight lines around her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone even as she tucked it into her purse, the slight tremor in her hands as she ordered wine before noon. Pinot Grigio, she told the server without looking, at the menu. The Italian one. I watched her settle into her chair, noting how she positioned herself to keep one eye on the restaurant's entrance. Even in her favorite place, she couldn't fully relax. The paranoia of someone living with secrets. "You look tired," I said after we'd ordered. "It's been a challenging few weeks." She managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind of performance she'd perfected for investor meetings and board presentations. "Between the restructuring you're requiring and trying to maintain investor confidence, I feel like I'm rebuilding the plane while flying it." The metaphor was telling. In her mind, she was still the pilot, still in control, still able to navigate through turbulence by sheer force of will and technical expertise. She hadn't yet grasped that the plane might be fundamentally unsound. "Are you sleeping?" "When I can. David's been helping, but there's so much to figure out. How do we explain to investors that our growth strategy was unsustainable? How do we rebuild user trust while completely changing our data practices? How do we maintain employee morale when we're essentially admitting that everything we've been doing was wrong?" She picked at her salad as she spoke, moving arugula around her plate without actually eating. Her wine glass, however, was already half empty. I'd seen Harold do the same thing during the worst days of his career, using alcohol as liquid courage for conversations he didn't want to have. "The employees are asking questions," she continued. "Smart questions. Yvette's new policies are making people wonder why we're suddenly so concerned about data ethics. Marcus in engineering actually asked me if we were in legal trouble. I had to lie to his face. What did you tell him? That we were being proactive, staying ahead of regulatory changes. That companies like us needed to demonstrate leadership in responsible AI development." She laughed bitterly. "Leadership. As if I have any idea what that means anymore." I watched my daughter struggle with questions that had no easy answers, feeling the weight of the USB drive in my purse like a stone in my chest. She was trying so hard to find ethical solutions to problems she didn't know were even bigger than she imagined. In her mind, the data privacy issues were her biggest challenge. She had no idea how much deeper the deception ran. "The board meeting is next week," she said, finally taking a bite of her salad. "Gerald's been asking pointed questions about our research partnerships. Apparently, someone told him our university collaborations weren't as robust as we'd indicated. I managed to deflect, but I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Gerald Morrison was Vitalé's lead investor, a veteran venture capitalist who'd built his reputation on identifying promising startups before they became unicorns. He was also known for his ruthless approach to founders who disappointed him. If he was asking questions about research partnerships, it meant he'd already started digging. Brooke, before we talk about restructuring, there's something I need to discuss with you. Something in my tone made her look up sharply, fork suspended halfway to her mouth. What? I reached into my purse and placed the USB drive on the table. Between us, the small black device looking innocuous against the rustic wood surface. Yvette brought this to me yesterday. It contains documentation of fraudulent claims in your investor presentations and marketing materials. The color drained from Brooke's face so quickly I worried she might faint. She stared at the drive as if it were a bomb that might explode at any moment, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I don't know what you think you found, but research, studies that don't exist, university partnerships that were never formalized, clinical trials that are actually marketing surveys, 2 years of systematic fraud designed to make Vitalé appear more scientifically validated than it actually is. The words hung in the air between us like an indictment. Around us, the restaurant continued its cheerful bustle, conversations about market opportunities and user acquisition metrics creating a soundtrack of Silicon Valley ambition. None of them knew they were witnessing a mother confronting her daughter with evidence of federal crimes. Brooke's hands were shaking now. She reached for her wine glass and drained half of it before speaking, the liquid giving her just enough. Courage to attempt a defense. Mom, you don't understand the pressure. Investors want validation. They want proof that your technology works. Everyone exaggerates in their presentations. Everyone stretches the truth to make their company look more attractive. Her voice had taken on a pleading quality, as if she could convince me that fraud was simply good marketing. I recognized the tone from her childhood, the way she'd tried to explain away broken curfews and failed tests by contextualizing them within peer behavior. Everyone doesn't fabricate research studies. I didn't. It wasn't supposed to. She stopped, realizing that denying the fraud was pointless when the evidence was sitting right in front of her. Her shoulders sagged as the weight of exposure settled over her. How much does Yvette know? Everything. And she's prepared a complete report documenting all the fraudulent claims. Brooke put her head in her hands, her carefully styled hair falling forward to create a curtain between her face and the world. When she spoke, her voice was muffled and small. My life is over. Not if you handle this correctly. She looked up at me with desperate hope, mascara slightly smudged beneath her eyes. For a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to run to me when she'd broken something valuable, believing that somehow I could fix anything. What do you mean? You have 2 choices. You can self-report the fraud to the Securities and Exchange Commission, cooperate fully with their investigation, and work with prosecutors to minimize the consequences. Or you can continue trying to cover it up and hope no one else discovers what Yvette found. I kept my voice steady and factual, the way Harold used to explain complex legal situations to clients. Emotional appeals wouldn't help Brooke understand the gravity of her situation, but clear analysis of her options might. What would happen if I self-report? Probably fines, possibly some jail time. Definitely the end of your career in tech leadership. But you'd be showing good faith cooperation, which judges and prosecutors consider when determining sentences. And if I don't report it? Eventually, someone else will discover the fraud. Maybe regulators, maybe investigative journalists, maybe competing companies looking for ways to discredit Vitalé. When that happens, you'll face much more serious charges because you'll be seen as someone who continued the deception even after being caught. I thought about Martha Stewart, about Elizabeth Holmes, about all the other high-profile women who'd fallen from grace in spectacular fashion. The justice system wasn't kind to female executives who betrayed trust, especially when their crimes involved deceiving investors about revolutionary technology. Brooke was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the street where her peers walked confidently toward their next meetings, their next funding rounds, their next opportunities to build empires. A group of young entrepreneurs passed by, animated in discussion about some breakthrough that would surely change everything. 6 months ago, Brooke had been one of them. "There's a third option," she said finally. "What?" "We restructure the company, like you wanted, but we quietly remove all the fraudulent claims without specifically calling attention to them. We rebrand around what the technology actually does, rather than fictional validation. We take the hit on valuation but avoid criminal charges." I'd been expecting this suggestion, the compromise that would protect Brooke while potentially making me complicit in covering up federal crimes. It was the kind of solution she'd always favored as a child, finding the middle path that minimized consequences while avoiding full accountability, and the investors who made decisions based on fraudulent information. They'll still have a stake in a real company with real technology and real potential. It's not like we stole their money. We just oversold the product. Her voice grew stronger as she warmed to the rationalization, falling back into the persuasive cadence she used in board meetings. Even now, facing the collapse of everything she'd built, she was trying to sell me on a solution that would protect her from the full consequences of her choices. "Brooke, listen to yourself. You're describing securities fraud as overselling. I'm describing survival. Do you know what happens to women who get convicted of corporate fraud? Do you know how that affects their children? Noah would grow up, knowing his mother is a felon. He'd face that stigma for the rest of his life. The mention of Noah hit me like a physical blow. I thought about my grandson's worried face when he'd asked if his family was in trouble, about his questions regarding the strange tension in our house. I thought about visiting days at federal, prison, about trying to explain to an 11-year-old why his mother couldn't come home, about the shame that would follow him through school and into adulthood. "There's another way," I said slowly. "What?" "You resign from Vitalé immediately. You transfer all your shares to me. You cooperate fully with cleaning up the fraudulent claims, and you start over somewhere else in a different industry, with a clean slate." "You want me to give up my company?" The pain in her voice was raw and immediate. Vitalé wasn't just Brooke's job or her investment. It was her identity, her proof that she belonged in the exclusive club of successful startup founders. Asking her to give it up was like asking her to amputate a limb. "I want you to save yourself from prison." Brooke stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and calculation. I could see her brilliant mind working through the implications, weighing the costs and benefits of each option with the same analytical approach she applied to product development decisions. "If I resign and transfer my shares, the fraud never gets reported?" "The fraud gets corrected, but not necessarily reported to authorities, unless future investigations uncover it, which becomes less likely if we remove all the fraudulent claims and rebuild on an honest foundation." "And you would run Vitalé?" "I would oversee the restructuring and then hand operational control to a vet or another qualified CEO. My goal isn't to run a tech company. It's to ensure that the company operates ethically." The irony wasn't lost on me. After spending months trying to prove I was too old and irrelevant to understand modern business, Brooke was now considering whether to trust me with her life's work. "What about David?" I hadn't considered Brooke's romantic partner and co-founder, who presumably knew at least some of what had been happening. That depends on how much he knew about the fraud and whether he's willing to support the restructuring. Our food arrived, but neither of us touched it. The conversation had reached the point where everything else became irrelevant. The carefully plated salmon and seasonal vegetables, the artisanal bread, the thoughtfully curated wine list. All of it felt like props in a play we were no longer performing. "Mom, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Are you doing this to punish me for saying you were too old to matter?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything that had happened over the past month. Was I motivated by love or revenge? By integrity or injured pride? The boundaries had become so blurred that I wasn't entirely sure myself. "Initially, maybe," I said. "But not anymore. Now I'm doing this because I love you too much to watch you destroy yourself. Even if it means I lose everything I've worked for." "You've already lost everything that matters. The company you built is based on lies. The success you're so proud of is fraudulent. The legacy you're creating is toxic. I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I'm trying to give you a chance. To build something real." Brooke was crying now. Tears she'd probably been holding back for months as the pressure and deception mounted. The polished executive facade cracked completely, revealing the frightened woman underneath who'd been carrying an impossible burden. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered. "It started with one exaggerated claim about one study, but then investors wanted more validation, and competitors were making bigger claims, and I felt like I had to keep up or lose everything. I know. I kept telling myself I'd fix it later, after we got established, after we had real validation, to replace the fake stuff. But there was never time, never a safe moment to step back and clean things up. It was the classic spiral of deception, each lie requiring another lie to support it, until the entire structure became so complex that dismantling it seemed impossible. I'd seen Harold struggle with similar situations, though never on this scale. There's time now." She looked at me across the table, my daughter who'd inherited Harold's brilliance and my determination, but had somehow lost her way in a world that rewarded growth over integrity. The restaurant around us had emptied as the lunch crowd returned to their offices, leaving us alone with our untouched food and the weight of an impossible decision. "If I do this, if I resign and transfer my shares, will you forgive me?" "Sweetheart, I forgave you the moment I decided to help you fix this, instead of just exposing it. And will you? Will you still be my mother? Even after everything I've done?" The question broke my heart. In her fear and shame, she'd somehow convinced herself that love was conditional on success, that maternal bonds could be severed by professional failure. It was perhaps the saddest indictment of the world she'd inhabited, where relationships were transactional and loyalty was based on performance metrics. "I'll always be your mother. That's not something you can lose, no matter what mistakes you make." Brooke nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with her napkin. The tears had smudged her makeup, making her look younger and more vulnerable. "Okay, let's do it. Let's save what we can, and start over." That afternoon, we met with Janet and Yvette to begin the complex process of transferring ownership and restructuring the company. The conference room at Janet's firm felt sterile and formal after our emotional lunch, all glass and steel surfaces that reflected our faces back at us in distorted fragments. Brooke signed papers resigning from all positions at Vitalé and transferring her shares to me. She also signed agreements to cooperate fully with removing fraudulent claims from all company materials. Each signature felt like a small death, a piece of her identity being formally severed. "The transition should be relatively smooth," Janet explained as she notarized the documents. Margaret will serve as interim CEO while we conduct a search for permanent leadership. Yvette will oversee the immediate restructuring of research claims and marketing materials. What about employee communications? Yvette asked. The team will want to know why Brooke is stepping down. We'll say she's pursuing other opportunities, I said. No need to create panic or speculation. The hardest part was watching her clean out her office, packing up the personal items that had marked her territory in the space she'd built from nothing. The motivational quotes printed on expensive paper and mounted in designer frames, the awards from industry organizations, the photos of successful product launches, all of it reduced to boxes that would be stored in my garage until she figured out what came next. Her desk, a sleek piece of Scandinavian design that had cost more than most people's cars, looked barren without her personal touches. The multiple monitors that had displayed real-time user analytics and market data sat dark and silent. Even the expensive, ergonomic chair seemed deflated without her presence. "What will you tell Noah?" I asked as we loaded the boxes into my car. The truth, that I made mistakes and had to leave the company, but that you're helping me fix things. And David and I... That's complicated. He knew something was wrong, but he trusted me to handle it. Finding out that I was lying to him along with everyone else? She shrugged sadly. Some relationships don't survive that kind of betrayal. As we drove home through the late afternoon traffic, I thought about the price of integrity, about the cost of doing the right thing even when it meant watching someone you love lose everything they'd worked for. The tech campuses we passed were buzzing with activity, young professionals heading to happy hours where they'd network and pitch ideas and dream about becoming the next unicorn founder. But I also thought about Noah, about the grandmother I wanted to be for him. Did I want to be the woman who helped cover up crimes? Or did I want to be the woman who showed him that mistakes could be corrected, that starting over was always possible, that love meant helping people do the right thing even when it was painful? "Mom," Brooke said as we pulled into my driveway. "Yes?" "Thank you for not letting me destroy myself completely." I looked at my daughter, brilliant and flawed and human, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope for easy solutions or perfect outcomes, but hope that we could build something honest from the wreckage of her ambitions. "That's what mothers do," I said. "We save our children from themselves, even when they're old enough to know better." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Brooke's resignation. I arrived at Vitalé's offices early, using the executive access card that was now mine as the company's majority shareholder. The building felt different, without Brooke's energy animating it. Quieter, more uncertain, like a ship that had lost its captain in the middle of a storm. I'd spent the weekend reviewing every document Yvette had compiled, understanding the full scope of the deception that had infected Vitalé's foundation. It wasn't just fraudulent research claims. The company had also misrepresented user engagement metrics, inflated revenue projections, and created fictional testimonials from medical professionals who didn't exist. The web of lies was so comprehensive that untangling it felt like performing surgery on a patient who might not survive the operation. Gregory Walsh and Sarah Chen arrived together, their faces grim with the knowledge that their $40 million investment was built on fraudulent claims. David Kim looked hollow-eyed and defeated, clearly struggling with the discovery that his romantic and business partner had been systematically deceiving everyone, including him. "Before we begin," I said once everyone was seated, "I want to acknowledge how difficult this situation is for all of us. You invested in good faith based on information you had every reason to trust. That information has proven to be inaccurate, and I take full responsibility for addressing the consequences. Elaine, Gregory said carefully, we appreciate your transparency, but we need to understand the full scope of the problem. How much of Vitalé's claimed validation was fraudulent? I handed out copies of Yvette's report, watching their faces as they absorbed the scope of the deception, the fabricated university partnerships, the non-existent clinical trials, the manipulated user data, the fictional research citations. Jesus Christ, Sarah whispered, setting down the report after reading the executive summary. This isn't just exaggeration or marketing spin. This is systematic fraud. Yes, I said simply. Are we looking at criminal liability? Gregory asked. Potentially, which is why we need to make some difficult decisions about how to proceed. David finally spoke up, his voice hoarse with emotion. Where's Brooke? She should be here to explain, herself. Brooke has resigned from all positions at Vitalé and transferred her ownership stake to me. She's also committed to cooperating fully with cleaning up the fraudulent claims. She just left? David looked stunned. She built this company from nothing, and she's just walking away. She's accepting responsibility for her mistakes and removing herself from a situation where her continued presence would make remediation more difficult. What exactly are you proposing we do? Sarah asked. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard where Brooke used to diagram growth strategies and product roadmaps. We have 3 options. First, we can self-report the fraud to the SEC, cooperate fully with their investigation, and hope to minimize legal consequences through transparency and good faith efforts to make investors whole. What would that mean practically? Gregory asked. Complete company dissolution, likely criminal charges for Brooke, civil lawsuits from investors, and no recovery of your invested capital. The room was silent for a moment. Second option, I continued. We can quietly restructure the company, remove all fraudulent claims, rebuild on an honest foundation, and hope that no external investigation uncovers the original deception. That's essentially conspiracy to cover up securities fraud, Sarah said. Yes, which brings us to the third option. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared over the weekend, containing documents that had been among the most difficult I'd ever had to create. We vote to dissolve Vitalé entirely. We liquidate all assets, return as much capital as possible to investors, and ensure that employees receive severance packages and job placement assistance. We end this cleanly, without criminal exposure, and without ongoing liability. David leaned forward. You want to destroy the company? I want to prevent the company from destroying everyone associated with it. But what about the technology? What about the genuine value we've created? The meditation platform actually works, even if the validation was fabricated. The user engagement is real, even if the metrics were inflated. There's still something here worth saving. I looked at David with sympathy. He was grieving not just the loss of his professional partnership with Brooke, but the loss of a dream they'd built together. David, the technology has value, but it's inseparable from fraudulent claims that could trigger investigations at any time. As long as Vitalé exists, everyone associated with it lives with the risk that the fraud will be discovered and prosecuted. What about our employees? Yvette asked. 47 people who joined this company because they believed in its mission. Do they deserve to lose their jobs because of decisions they weren't part of? No, they don't. Which is why I'm proposing generous severance packages and active job placement assistance. I've already reached out to contacts at other wellness tech companies who are interested in hiring Vitalé's entire engineering team. you've already started planning the dissolution?" Sarah's voice was sharp with surprise. "I've started preparing for multiple scenarios, including the one where doing the right thing means accepting significant financial losses." Gregory pulled out his phone and began making calculations. "If we dissolve and liquidate, what kind of recovery rate are we looking at?" "Based on preliminary assessments, probably 30 to 40 cents on the dollar. The office lease can be terminated. The technology assets have real value, and there's some cash remaining from the last funding round. So we lose 60% of our investment to protect ourselves from criminal liability. Yes." The room fell silent except for the sound of fingers tapping on phones as everyone calculated their personal losses. These were people who'd built careers on making smart bets with other people's money. Accepting a 60% loss on a fraudulent investment wasn't just financially painful. It was professionally humiliating. "There's something else you need to consider," I said quietly. "If the fraud is ever discovered, by regulators, by competitors, by investigative journalists, and it comes out that you knew about it and chose to cover it up, you'll face criminal liability, along with civil penalties. The 40% recovery you're debating could become 100% loss plus prison time." "You're saying the safest choice is dissolution," Sarah said. "I'm saying the most ethical choice is dissolution. The safest choice for everyone except the employees who lose their jobs and the customers who lose a service they genuinely value." David stood up abruptly. "This is insane. We're talking about destroying a company that has real value because Brooke made some bad decisions about how to market it. The underlying technology works. The users love it. We could fix the fraud problem and rebuild on an honest foundation." "We could try," I said. "But David, you need to understand something. The fraud isn't a marketing problem. It's a foundation problem. Vitalé was built on false premises that infected every aspect of the business model. Trying to rebuild while carrying that baggage would be like trying to renovate a house built on a sinkhole. So your solution is to tear down the house entirely? My solution is to acknowledge that some mistakes are too big to fix, and that sometimes starting over is the only way to build something sustainable." Gregory cleared his throat. "Elaine, what happens to you in all of this? You've invested significant capital in acquiring controlling interest. Are you prepared to absorb the total loss?" I thought about Harold, about the conservative investment strategy that had left me with more wealth than I'd ever expected. I thought about Noah, about the kind of legacy I wanted to leave him. "I can afford the financial loss," I said. "What I can't afford is to be part of a cover-up that could destroy people I care about." The vote was closer than I'd expected. Gregory and Sarah ultimately supported dissolution, motivated primarily by fear of criminal liability. David voted against it, still hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his dreams. Yvette abstained, torn between loyalty to the employees and recognition that the company was probably beyond saving. As the majority shareholder, my vote was decisive, and I voted for dissolution. The paperwork took 3 hours to complete. Dissolution, notices to be filed with the state of California, employee termination letters with severance package details, customer communications explaining that the service would be discontinued, asset liquidation schedules, and creditor notifications. By noon, Vitalé officially ceased to exist. I was the last person to leave the building, walking through empty offices where brilliant people had worked to build something they believed would make the world better. The meditation pods where employees had taken mindfulness breaks, the whiteboard still covered with product roadmaps and growth projections, the kitchen where teams had gathered to celebrate milestones and commiserate over setbacks. It felt like walking through a tomb. As I drove home, I thought about the price of integrity, about the cost of choosing principles over profit. I'd spent $40 million to teach my daughter a lesson about business ethics, and in the process, I'd destroyed a company that might have been reformed instead of dissolved. But I'd also prevented criminal prosecutions that could have sent Brooke to prison. I'd protected investors from ongoing liability. I'd given employees a chance to start over with clean reputations and valuable experience. Most importantly, I'd shown Noah that some things matter more than money or success or maintaining appearances, that sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting losses that seem unbearable. My phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. "Saw the news. Thank you for making the hard choice. I love you." I pulled over and sat in my car for a few minutes, crying for the company that might have been, for the daughter who'd lost her way, for the employees who'd trusted their careers to a dream built on lies. But I also cried with relief, because for the first time in months, I could sleep without wondering when the other shoe would drop. 6 months after Vitalé's dissolution, I was sitting in my garden on a Sunday morning when Noah arrived with a folded piece of paper clutched in his small hands. He'd spent the night at my house, part of the new routine we'd established after Brooke started her job at a non-profit health clinic in Oakland, a position that paid a fraction of what she'd earned as a CEO, but allowed her to sleep peacefully for the first time in years. "I drew something for you, Grandma Elaine," Noah said, settling beside me on the wooden bench Harold had built 20 years ago. He unfolded the paper to reveal a crayon drawing of 3 figures standing in front of what looked like my Victorian row house. The tallest figure had silver hair and was wearing blue, clearly meant to be me. The medium-sized figure had dark hair and a stethoscope, representing Brooke in her new role as a community health coordinator. The smallest figure was holding both their hands, a smile drawn in bright red across his face. "It's our family," Noah explained. After everything got better, I studied the drawing, noting how he'd made sure all 3 figures were connected, their crayon hands touching to form an unbroken chain. In the background, he'd drawn the sun shining over San Francisco's hills, with what appeared to be Harold's vegetable garden in full bloom. "It's beautiful," I said, meaning it completely. "Can you tell me about what you mean by after everything got better?" Noah was quiet for a moment, the way children are when they're trying to find words for feelings that are bigger than their vocabulary. When Mom was running her company, she was sad all the time, but pretending to be happy. And you were angry, but pretending not to be. And I was scared, but pretending I didn't notice. The observation hit me with its simple accuracy. "And now?" "Now, Mom is actually happy, even though her job is harder and she makes less money. And you're not angry anymore. And I don't have to pretend I don't see things." I hugged him closer, marveling at the emotional intelligence of a child who'd navigated the adult complexities of corporate fraud and family conflict with more grace than most of the adults involved. "Noah, do you understand what happened with your mom's company?" "Kind of. She made some mistakes and you helped her fix them. But fixing them meant the company had to close down. Are you upset about that?" He considered the question seriously. "I was upset at first because I thought it meant we were poor now and might have to move. But Mom explained that we have enough money and that Grandma Elaine makes sure our family is safe." "And how do you feel about everything now?" "I feel like maybe mistakes aren't the end of the world if people help you fix them." Brooke emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray with coffee for me and orange juice for Noah. She looked different than she had during her CEO days, more relaxed, less perfectly polished, wearing jeans and a Stanford sweatshirt instead of designer. Blazers! She'd gained a few pounds and let her natural grey streak grow out, changes that made her look younger, rather than older. "What are you two plotting out here?" she asked, settling into Harold's old Adirondack chair. "Noah drew a picture of our family, after everything got better," I said, showing her the drawing. Brooke studied it with the same careful attention she'd once given to market research reports. "I love how you made sure we're all holding hands," she told Noah. "Even when families go through difficult times, we don't let go of each other." "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always. Are you sad that your company is gone?" Brooke was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing how much honesty was appropriate for an 11-year-old. "I'm sad about some parts of it," she said, finally. "I miss working with smart people to solve interesting problems. I miss the excitement of building something new. But I'm not sad about the company being gone, because the company wasn't built on solid ground." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I was so focused on making the company look successful that I forgot to make sure it actually was successful. I was more worried about what other people thought than about whether we were doing the right things." "Like lying about stuff?" "Yes. Like lying about stuff." Noah nodded seriously. "In school, when kids lie about their grades or whether they studied for tests, the teacher says it just makes things worse later." "Your teacher is very wise." "Is that why Grandma Elaine bought your company? To stop the lying from making things worse?" I exchanged glances with Brooke, both of us amazed by Noah's ability to distill complex adult situations into simple truths. "Part of it," I said. "But mostly, I got involved because I love your mom, and I could see that she was trapped in a situation that was making her unhappy and scared. Were you mad at her?" "I was hurt when she said I was too old to matter, but I was never mad at her for making mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes." "Even you?" "Especially me. One of my biggest mistakes was staying quiet for so long, when I should have spoken up about things I thought were wrong." Noah finished his orange juice and went inside to use the bathroom, leaving Brooke and me alone in the garden. The late morning sun was warming the air, and I could hear the distant sound of church bells from the cathedral on Nob Hill. "Mom, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "The job at the clinic. I love it. For the first time in years, I wake up, excited about going to work instead of anxious about what crisis I'll have to manage." "What's different about it?" "Everything I do actually helps people. When I develop a program to help diabetic patients manage their condition, I can see the direct impact on their health outcomes. When I coordinate care for elderly patients, I know I'm making their lives better in measurable ways." No growth. Targets or investor presentations? No growth targets or investor presentations. Just solving real problems for real people with real solutions. I thought about Harold, about how he'd always insisted that the most satisfying work was the kind that made a tangible difference in people's lives. He would have been proud of the path Brooke had chosen, even if it meant walking away from the prestige and financial rewards of tech entrepreneurship. "Do you ever regret the way things turned out?" Brooke was quiet for a long time, pulling weeds from the flower bed with the same focused attention she'd once applied to market analysis. "I regret the lying," she said finally. "I regret letting fear drive me to make choices that compromised everything I believed in. I regret putting Noah through months of watching his mother stress about things she couldn't even explain to him. But I don't regret that you intervened. And I don't Regret that the company dissolved, because the company I'd built wasn't worthy of the mission I claimed to care about. What about David? David and I... She sighed. David needed time to process the fact that I'd been lying to him along with everyone else. He's dating someone else now, another entrepreneur who shares his optimism about changing the world through technology. Are you okay with that? I'm sad about losing the relationship, but I understand why he couldn't stay. Trust is the foundation of any partnership, and I destroyed that foundation with my deception. Noah returned from the house carrying his backpack and a basketball, clearly ready for our planned trip to the neighborhood court where Harold had taught him to shoot free throws. Ready for basketball, Grandma? Almost. Let me just grab my shoes. As I laced up my sneakers, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Deidre the night before. My friend had been tracking the aftermath of Vitalé's dissolution through her extensive network of Silicon Valley contacts. You know what's interesting? Deidre had said. Nobody in the tech world is talking about Vitalé's closure as a failure. They're talking about it as a case study in responsible corporate governance. What do you mean? Several business schools are using your decision as an example of how to handle ethical crises. The fact that you chose dissolution over cover-up, that you prioritized integrities over profit, that you protected employees and investors from criminal liability. It's being held up as a model for how corporate leadership should work. I just did what seemed right, which is exactly why it's noteworthy. Most people in your position would have chosen the cover-up. At the basketball court, I watched Noah practice the shooting form Harold had taught him. His small hands carefully positioned on the ball, his eyes focused on the rim with intense concentration. Brooke sat beside me on the bench, both of us enjoying the simple pleasure of watching a child master a new skill through patience and repetition. Mom, can I ask you something I've been wondering about? Anything. When you started buying shares of Vitalé, what did you think would happen? What was your best-case scenario? I considered the question carefully, remembering the anger and hurt that had motivated my initial actions. Honestly, I thought I'd prove that I still mattered by taking control of your company and showing you how to run it properly. I thought you'd be grateful for my experience and wisdom, and that we'd end up working together to build something even more successful. And your worst-case scenario? That you'd hate me forever but at least respect my competence. You never imagined we'd end up dissolving the company entirely? Never. That possibility didn't occur to me until I learned about the fraud. Then everything changed because I realized that saving the company might mean destroying you. Noah made 3 free throws in a row and ran over to us with a huge grin. Did you see? I made 3 in a row just like Grandpa Harold taught me. I saw, I said, pulling him into a hug. Grandpa would be so proud of you. Do you think he would be proud of how we fixed Mom's company problem too? The question caught me off guard with its simple directness. I think Grandpa Harold would be proud that we chose to do the right thing even when it was expensive and difficult, and that we didn't let the problem break our family apart. Especially that. As we walked home through the neighborhood where I'd lived for 40 years, I thought about legacy and what it means to matter. I'd started this journey feeling invisible and irrelevant, dismissed by a daughter who'd forgotten where she came from. I'd ended it by destroying a $40 million company and helping my daughter rebuild her life on an honest foundation. The financial cost had been enormous. The emotional cost had been even higher. But the alternative, watching Brooke destroy herself through deception and ethical compromise, would have been unbearable. That evening, as Noah helped me prepare dinner and Brooke graded community health assessments at the kitchen table, I realized that this was what success actually looked like. Not magazine covers or investor presentations or market valuations, but a family that had survived crisis with their love intact. Not growth at any cost, but growth that was sustainable and honest. I pulled Noah's drawing from my purse and taped it to the refrigerator, right next to the photo of Harold and me on our wedding day, 47 years ago. "Why are you putting it there?" Noah asked. "Because it shows the most important thing I've ever accomplished. Building a family that doesn't give up on each other." That's exactly right. Outside, the fog was rolling in from the Pacific, softening the edges of the city and making everything look gentle and forgiving. Inside, 3 generations sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal and planning tomorrow's small adventures. Was 76 years old, and I had never mattered more. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.